The wind was screaming across the mountains when Cael Armitage saw the SUV flip once, twice, then vanish into a curtain of white so thick it looked as if the world itself had swallowed it whole. For a split second, he froze on the snowy trail, his breath sharp in his throat, his dark brown hands gripping the straps of his backpack. The memory of another accident, the one that took his wife, flashed like lightning behind his eyes. The sound of metal crunching, the silence that followed, the hospital lights that felt too bright, too cruel. But then instinct surged. He ran. He ran. Even though the blizzard was raging, even though his boots kept sinking into the powder, even though he had no guarantee anyone inside that SUV was still alive, he ran because he knew what it felt like to wait for help that never came. And he refused to let another human being die alone in the cold. Cael reached the wrecked vehicle just as snow began to bury it. The windows were shattered, the doors warped from the impact, and the bitter daylight was fatting under the choking clouds. He pulled at the door until it cracked open with a groan of twisted metal. Inside, he found a woman barely conscious, slumped over the steering wheel, her breath trembling in the frozen air. Her rich brown skin was pale with cold, her lips tinged with blue. Blood trickled from a cut along her temple, bright red against her dark complexion. Her name, he would later learn, was Selene Korrin, the famously relentless CEO of Novara Systems. A woman whose world operated in elevators, boardrooms, and billion-dollar negotiations, not icy mountain passes where nature didn't care about your net worth or your reputation. Right now, though, she wasn't powerful. She wasn't polished. She was cold, shivering, and dangerously pale. Her natural hair, which had likely been styled immaculately that morning, was now damp with melted snow, the tight coils beginning to freeze at the edges. Her designer red dress, elegant and utterly impractical for a mountain road, clung to her frame, offering no protection against the elements. Cael didn't waste a second. He lifted her carefully into his arms, feeling how light and fragile she seemed despite her reputation. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel her shallow breathing against his neck. Her lips moved faintly as though she wanted to protest, but no words came. Only a soft, frightened sound that made his heart clench. The storm was worsening. He could barely see 3 ft ahead, the wind whipping snow into his face with stinging force. He knew he couldn't get her down the trail safely. Not in this weather, not with her slipping toward hypothermia, not with visibility this poor. So he headed toward the only shelter nearby, an old logging cabin abandoned years ago but still standing, tucked behind a ring of frostbitten pines. He had used it once while hiking with his 8-year-old son, Eli, and he prayed it hadn't collapsed under winter's weight. By some miracle, the cabin was still there, its roof bowed but intact, the door hanging slightly crooked on rusty hinges. He pushed inside, the door protesting with a loud creak, and laid Selene down against a bundle of old quilts someone had left behind years ago. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, and the temperature inside was barely warmer than outside. There was no fireplace, only an old metal stove that smoked if you looked at it wrong. But Cael had learned to work with what he had. He gathered the driest pieces of wood he could find from a pile in the corner, coaxed kindling into flame with practiced hands, and managed to get the stove working. The room slowly warmed, though the cold still clung to them like a second skin. Cael removed his own jacket and draped it over Selene, then found the thickest blanket in the pile. Rough, smelling faintly of dust and time, but warm. He wrapped it around her shoulders and checked her pulse. It was weak but steady. That was something. He boiled snow in an old pot he found, letting it cool just enough to be drinkable, then gently lifted her head and helped her take small sips. She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. "Easy," he said softly, his deep voice a contrast to the howling wind outside. "You're safe, just rest." Selene blinked awake in the thin afternoon light filtering through the frosted window. She looked disoriented, her dark eyes unfocused, her breath shaking as she tried to make sense of where she was. Where? Her voice came out as a rasp, barely audible. "You crashed," Cael said gently, kneeling beside her. "The storm's too bad to get you down the mountain right now, but you're safe. We're in an old cabin. I got a fire going." She stared at him, confusion written across her beautiful features. Her gaze traveled from his face, his deep brown skin, the concern in his dark eyes, the slight graying at his temples, down to his worn flannel shirt and weathered hands. This wasn't her world. This wasn't the polished offices and luxury cars and men in tailored suits. This was raw survival, and she didn't know how to process it. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Cael Armitage. I was hiking when I saw your car go off the road. You saved me. I did what anyone would do." But they both knew that wasn't true. Most people would have run for help, waited for professionals, protected themselves from liability and danger. He had run toward the wreck, not away from it. Selene tried to sit up, but the movement made her WSC. Pain shot through her ribs and her head spun. She gasped, her hand flying to her temple where the cut throbbed. Cael moved closer, steadying her with gentle hands. "Don't push it, you need to rest, you might have a concussion." She looked at him again, really looked at him this time. She saw the tired lines on his face, the quiet strength in his posture, the calloused hands that had pulled her from death. She saw kindness there. Something she hadn't encountered in so long that it almost frightened her. I don't even know what happened," she said, her voice trembling. "I was driving to a conference. The roads were clear and then suddenly black ice." Cael said, "Common up here this time of year. The sun melts the snow just enough during the day, then it freezes over at night. You can't see it until it's too late." She closed her eyes, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. "I should have known better. I should have. Hey." His voice was firm but kind. "You're alive. That's what matters." Afternoon became early evening, though the storm outside remained brutally bright, its light nearly colorless. Sometimes the world turned harshest in the day, not the night. The temperature in the cabin had risen enough that Cael could remove his outer layers without freezing, but Selene was still shivering despite the blankets wrapped around her. Her body was going into shock, her core temperature dangerously low. She tried to hide it, tried to maintain some shard of composure. But he could see the way her jaw trembled, the way her fingers wouldn't stop shaking even when she tucked them under her arms. "You need to get warmer," Cael said, adding more wood to the stove. "Your body temperature is still too low." "I'm fine," she said, but her teeth chattered on the last word, betraying her. "You're not fine. You're hypothermic." She looked away, embarrassed to be so vulnerable in front of a stranger. In her world, showing weakness was dangerous. Admitting you needed help was a liability. But here in this freezing cabin with death still hovering close, none of those rules applied. "I don't know what else to do," she admitted quietly, her voice breaking. "I can't stop shaking." Cael hesitated. He knew what needed to happen. Shared body heat was often the best treatment for hypothermia when medical care wasn't available. But the intimacy of it, the vulnerability, made him pause. He thought of his wife, of the last time he had held someone close, of the promises he'd made to himself, about keeping boundaries, protecting his heart. But this wasn't about his heart. This was about keeping another human being alive. "There's a way," he said carefully, "but I need your permission." Selene met his eyes, understanding dawning in her gaze. For a moment she looked terrified, not of him, but of the intimacy, the trust it would require. In her world, closeness always came with a price, always had an agenda, but something in his eyes told